Good morning, everybody, and a happy New Year to all. Very excited about continuing the series of webinars into 2021. My name is Michael Mandillo, and I'm president of First Service Residential, and we are pleased at First Service Residential to continue this process of educating our listeners. We have a huge attendees today, actually record-breaking for us. So the need for this continues to inspire us by all of our listeners feeling that the information that we're sharing is good information and good nuggets to continue to coach and partner with our board members, not only the First Service Residential board members that are on, but we also have other board members from communities we don't manage, and we welcome everybody because it is an opportunity for us to educate and help and give back. To kick off this year with our webinar, we're hitting on a topic of reserve studies and beyond. We have 3 subject matter experts. Typically what we do, probably about 98% of the webinars we have done through, started from the pandemic. That really is what ignited us to keep our communities informed and educated in real time as things were moving in a quick pace daily sometimes. We saw that after we got into a routine that notwithstanding the pandemic, there were still things that needed to be done in the day-to-day of our business that was not altered by the pandemic, but had to be layered in on dealing with those issues at the same time. So we have graduated into talking about just very important topics. How we go about that, folks, is we have 8,500 communities, 8,500 communities throughout North America that come from mid-rises, high-rises, HOAs, small portfolio HOAs to large portfolio HOAs, to sited condominiums, large-scale communities, highly amenitized communities that have a resort feel to it, if you will, as well as active adult communities. So we look at all of our portfolio that we manage in all those areas, and we try to find some common ground that we see things are trending, and or where we see things might be coming up, may it be seasonally driven or just stuff that might be driven by the economy or by the pandemic or anything else that may occur. And that's where we kind of come up with the topics. Also, we get a tremendous amount of feedback from our listeners or attendees that have been very loyal during the 40, I think we're close to 50 of these webinars we have done over 10 months. So it's been pretty remarkable in reference to us. So with that, we take 45 minutes. About 25 to 30 of that is enriched content. We have 3 speakers that are all First Service Residential subject matter experts. Stacy and Tim and Tori are our guest internal subject matter experts. They'll take a component each. Then we'll open it up to take questions. We ask you to please feel free to email us questions as it goes along in real time. Then we'll open it up, and Eileen Jablonski, who's our Vice President of Communication at First Service, will facilitate that, and we'll close it out. So with that, pleased to introduce our first speaker, and topics today is reserve studies and beyond. Stacy, I will pass it to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Michael. My name is Stacy Gelfand. I am the Vice President at First Service Residential. I have been managing community associations for well over 30 years, close to 33 years, and I've been with First Service Residential for the past 3 years. So I appreciate everybody attending this morning and look forward to hearing some of your questions. So to get started, kind of what is a reserve study? And so wanted to first talk about what it is. So it's a capital budget planning tool, which is used to determine the physical status and repair or replacement cost of any capital components and the analysis of the association's funding capacity to maintain, repair, replace capital components. So this means that the board should look at what it is that they have to maintain and make sure that those are included in there. In general, a lot of times associations determine that there's a threshold, that if it's going to be under a certain amount of dollars, that it's more of an operating expense. And anything over a certain threshold, sometimes it's as low as 5,000 or 10,000, that gets funded into the reserves. So with that, it's really just a budget portion of the assessments collected from the owners. So the funds in the reserves are set aside for paying the cost to repair and replace those capital components when the need rises. And a lot of times owners will ask, well, why do I have to put into reserves? Because the roof is going to last for 50 years and I don't intend on living here for 50 years. And the reason that reserves are funded on an annual basis is because they're intended to be equitably distributed over the cost of maintaining that capital component over the lifetime of that. So in a kind of a perfectly funded system, each owner kind of pays their fair share for the use of the property during the time of their ownership in the community. But again, it's not a spending plan, so it's not just because the reserve study says that the roofs have to be replaced in 2025, and you get somebody to look at the roofs and they've got another 3 years, you can delay that repair. Or on the other side, if the roof needs to be repaired sooner, you would have to do that sooner. So it's not a spending plan. But it does allow for the board to kind of plan with the budget so that properly funded reserves minimize the chance of having special assessments or any type of fees or loans that they may need to pay for repairing or replacing those capital components. And then with the properly funded reserves, the large cost of maintaining capital components can be evenly spread over time and making the assessments more predictable. As far as how often the association needs one, right now there's less than 5 states that actually require a study to be performed. Although, as we're seeing across the country, more and more legislation is starting to come down requiring some type of at least study so that the associations are required to at least know what their capital components are and come up with a plan. Within the industry itself, updating the reserve study is usually something that's every 3 to 5 years, depending on the type of community that you have. And when we talk about updating that study, kind of gets us into talking about the types of reserve studies. So in general, there are 3 different levels. And the first one is a level 1 study. And that level 1 study is when an engineer comes out to the community and looks at all of the components and starts from scratch. So they don't look at any past reports or anything else. They come out, they look at the useful life of all the components and what their current life is and creates a plan. The level 2 is kind of what most communities use, and that's where they come out and they're updating a previous study. So they're looking at that study, but they are going out and looking at all the components and estimating again what the current life is and what the estimated lifespan of that component is, but they're not taking new measurements. And then the last type is the level 3, and that's just basically where they're taking the reserve study that you currently have and they're just updating the figures as far as the cost, inflation, or interest and how much funding is currently in the reserves, and they're not going out and doing any types of site visits. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the challenges in preparing for that study. A lot of times associations get a reserve study and they look at it maybe during budget cycle, and other than that, nothing is done to that study. And so the challenges that a lot of companies have when they're trying to do the reserve studies is to find out when was the last time the pool was under a major refurbishment. When was the last time the clubhouse had the hot water heater replaced? When was the last time the boiler was replaced in the high rise? So making sure that the association keeps detailed records of every time concrete is replaced, or the asphalt seal coating is done, or any project that is done that's within your reserve study, making sure that you have recorded and kept notes on when it was done and how much it was, and how much of that component was either repaired or replaced. And that will help you with making sure that your reserve study is all that it needs to be in order to help the board make their decisions on a yearly basis. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over now to Tim Snowden.
Thank you, Stacy. Hello, I'm Tim Snowden, and really thrilled to be here today. I'm a regional director with FirstService Residential, been with the company for 8 years, and overall in the industry 20 years. And today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, bidding reserve studies. That is really one of the things that I love to do with boards, help them get a good reserve study. As Stacy said, you know, we got to start with a good reserve study. The first thing you have to remember is that one size does not fit all. Reserve studies are going to be tailored to your community and your specific needs. You know, the needs of a single family home, HOA, or a townhome, or a high rise or a mid rise are going to be much different. So how do we get a good study? Well, it always starts with developing the request for proposal. And the first thing we have to look at is, do we need a 20-year or do we need a 30-year reserve study? And you can debate 20 versus 30 years all day long. But what I found is that if you're a community such as single family home community, and your capital replacements are going to be big projects, right? Paving roads, retention ponds, lighting, a 30-year is probably good, because these are things that you're only going to do, you know, in 10-year, 20-year blocks, right? If you're a mid-rise condo or a high-rise condo, you're probably looking at more like a 20-year, because you're going to be changing out components and replacing those at a much quicker rate. So that's the first thing you need to look at. What is your inventory, and how often are these things going to be replaced? Then once you figure that out, you want to take a look at, do we need a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3? Right? Stacy talked quite a bit about this, so I'm not going to go into detail there. But I will say, you probably won't have much of an RFP if you get a level 3. Because as Stacy said, you're really just updating an older reserve study where they never really leave their desk. But if you get to level 1 or level 2, you know, you're going to definitely want a little more detail. And what we want to do is we always look at our 3 different funding plans when we start bidding out a reserve study. So there's 3 basic plans that we look at for funding. Full funding. Full funding is simply the idea that we're putting aside money to replace our components every year. So if you got something that has a 20-year useful life, you're putting 1/20th of aside every year, right? And you probably heard that term before, because, you know, real estate agents will ask questions like, are the reserves fully funded? Well, the truth is very few associations do full funding. Most associations do what we call threshold funding, which is making sure that there's always enough money in the account at any given year to pay for those replacements that we have to do with our reserves. So when we do a reserve study, we're going to talk more about threshold funding, because we want to find that sweet spot, right? And then lastly, baseline funding. Baseline funding is the concept that every year we're just going to ask for as much money as we need. So if we need $100,000 one year to replace the roof, that's all we're going to ask for. That's all we're going to put in the budget, right? So it's important that we look at all 3 of those tables, though, because that's going to give the board information. Don't let your reserve provider decide, I'm going to give you full funded, threshold funding, or baseline. Now, one thing we need to talk about is setting a realistic threshold, right, on minimum replacement cost. And Stacy hit that. A lot of times the reserve provider will determine for themselves what the minimum threshold is for replacement costs. So maybe anything under $7,000 is not included in your reserve study. $7,000 is a number I see a lot. But that number is going to be determined really by your budget. So if you have a multi-million-dollar budget, maybe you can afford to make replacements every year that are less than $7,000. But if you have a $500,000 budget, right, you might even look at $100,000 as the minimum threshold for replacement costs, because smaller associations with smaller budgets, are more challenged to even make $1,000 replacements. And when you're bidding a reserve study, you want to make sure that you specify that you get both parts of the reserve study. The financial analysis is what a lot of us are familiar with. It's that chart, it's that graph. It's going to show you how much money you have to put into reserves every year and how much you're taking out. But you also want to make sure that you get what they call the physical analysis or the condition report. And that's really the inventory of all your components. And you want to make sure you put that in the RFP, because sometimes you just might get that chart in the graph, and maybe with a small narrative, if you don't specify that's what you need. And you also want to specify how many meetings you want to have with the reserve provider. And this is important. Normally we want to do a meeting with the reserve provider before the reserve study is done, right? The board wants to list their concerns. Maybe you have an old reserve study that you're not really happy with. Maybe you want to make sure that they know your priorities. Our roof is the priority before the pool, right? So make sure you schedule a meeting before, and then there'll be several meetings usually after the reserve study is done, because we'll go through different drafts. So now I'm going to leave you with 4 points here. First of all, choose a provider that meets your needs of your community. This is key. If you know what type of replacements that you have scheduled up, right? Look for somebody who's got the same background in those kinds of projects, right? So if facade is one of your major issues, look for companies, that have facade experience, or parking garages, or retention ponds, or roads, depending on the type of community you are. If you can find a provider who has real hands-on experience managing these types of projects, you're going to get much better prices. You're going to get a much better analysis of the condition. And the big key here that I always talk about is reserve studies are a journey, right? It continues even after you choose a provider. We talked about holding meetings, right, before the reserve study is prepared and before it's approved. But a lot of times we're keeping in touch with the person who gave us our reserve study every year, just to kind of look at, okay, where are we? And are there things we need to tweak? And of course, we're probably going to be using the same provider if we do a level 1 for our level 2 and level 3s, unless, of course, we got a really bad reserve study. But that's not going to happen if you do a good RFP. And the most important thing I want to talk about, and Stacy hit on this too, is that the board must walk away with a plan that they can really implement, right? Don't stick your reserve study up on the desk and let it collect dust and then pull it out every time there's a resale. No, every year we need to review that. We need to make sure it's something that we can work with. And that's important, that it's a living document that we're ready to update all the time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tori Pirano, who's going to take you beyond the initial study.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. So welcome, everyone. As Chief mentioned, my name is Tori Pirano, and I'm so happy you all have joined our webinar today. So they have touched on, well, a little bit about me first. I've been in the industry for over 5 years, and I've been with FirstService for 2 years. And so I've been managing quite a bit of different communities. So my part today, since they've talked about what is a reserve study and how to properly bid one out, I'm going to dive into how you're going to properly utilize the reserve study and what effects you may see if you do not have a reserve study or you do not utilize it correctly. So I'm going to begin with, there's 2 key points of a reserve study, which Tim briefly just talked about, was the physical financial analysis. And to me, they are both equal importance as they do play hand in hand with each other. The physical analysis assesses the physical condition of the common area property that the homeowners association is responsible for repairing and maintaining. It can range from roads, amenity centers, clubhouses, pools, tennis courts, you name it. The list can be very short for some, while for others it may be very extensive. It really just depends on what type and size community you live in. From there, the reserve specialist will analyze the property to give the community the cost of repair or replacement value. This is where the next key point of the financial analysis does come into play. Once the specialist completes his financial analysis. He's going to examine the association's financial health, meaning he's going to ask for your review of your financials to look at your expenses, your reserve fund health, and give their professional opinion on how you should properly plan. And as Stacy mentioned, it's not a financial plan. You need to look at your individual's financials and see what you do have in your funds and what you can afford. It's really a great guiding point, though. So it should be taken very serious when you do invest into having the reserve study. So from there, once they provide that information, you're then going to utilize that to plan properly for your reserve fund each year. So you'll take those recommendations, have your budget committee meeting or just the board spending time in your budget season. We all know that's a very fun thing to do. Everyone looks forward to the budget season. So you want to ensure that your reserve fund does not become out of date due to shifts in the economy, which can seriously affect your available funds and assessment income. So you always want to make sure that you're staying up to date year to year, as we know that there can be increases with building and labor costs and time and materials. So you just want to make sure that that is always accurate, which is why properly knowing how to budget each year is very critical. And so from there, we're going to talk a little bit into ways that you can implement the plan with your budget season and what may happen if you do not spend that time utilizing this tool. And it's very critical. I would always say this is a working tool. You don't just look at it and one and done. In budget season, you really prepare for all year. You don't just go into it 1 month and think, okay, we're going to have our budget ready. You want to make sure you invest a great amount of time. So that way you're not overwhelmed. You do a little bit each month to know what does your individual association need to do in the next year. So you're going to properly forecast what your plans are. So we're going to go into the next point where what happens if you may not utilize this in a very detailed manner in project planning. So the very first thing I want to talk about is there can be an issue with having special assessments, also known as supplemental fees. So special assessments or supplemental fees are words that owners, board members, anyone may not like to hear. And typically this can mean that HOAs do not properly foresee upcoming expenses or capital improvements, and this is not well received by homeowners. However, we all know that there are some circumstances that could be out of control of the board of directors that may have a need for special assessments, but most of the time it is due to not implementing some sort of the reserve studies recommendations or not even having one. And in fact, according to research from the CAI Institute, associations who do not update the reserve study every 3 years saw a 31.5% decrease in needing a special assessment, who do update the reserve study, If special assessments are given, this also can greatly impact the value of the community for resales, as potential owners will view this as maybe a red flag of the financial health for the community. And moving forward, one of my next points as well for an effect of not properly budgeting correctly for your reserves and also utilizing the reserve study or may not having one is that the HOA board has a fiscal and legal responsibility to maintain the common interests of the community. They're legally required to ensure that the HOA is prepared for common area repairs and maintenance costs. And while this is a huge responsibility, you want to make sure that it is taken seriously, so that way you don't lead to lawsuits and other legal liability, which also ultimately keeps the entire association in good standing and keeping your homeowners happy, which we always want to do. And then furthermore, by implementing your reserve study into your annual budgeting and forecasting for years to come, you do help avoid large increase in homeowner dues. And typically increases are seen between 2 to 4% yearly if they are needed. There's times that you may not even need to increase. You can remain consistent, constant through years to come, which is phenomenal. However, what scares homeowners and can be as another red flag is that dues jump $50 to $100 monthly or even quarterly if they're quarterly assessments. And again, that causes a disruption to the community, which will not be taken well. And by not having large increases, you continue to foster great relationships within your community. And that's ultimately what the goal is. You want everyone to feel that they love their community and it's not a financial burden when an unforeseen financial task comes to them. So as I'm wrapping up my portion of the presentation, I want to end with that by utilizing the reserve study beyond the initial review, it is extremely critical in many aspects that the board of directors not just use this once or twice and put it away, but in fact continue to use the study as a tool to allocate correct percentage of income to the reserve funds and to continue to develop the project plan annually of what major improvements or repairs will occur each year based off the results from their study. This allows for the study to be updated constantly with accurate details after you get your projects completed, and then you can continue to move forward and build with that study with properly forecasting for your financial health of your community. From here, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Michael Mandela.
Thank you, Tori. Thank you very much, Tim and Stacy. Terrific job. Folks, the important part, I think, is all of you know the value and the importance of a reserve study. I think what's also important and kind of a couple of nuggets to pull out is this is not a plug and play. There are times and vendors out there that kind of plug and play a formula. It is so important that your interaction with your management company, your manager, supervisors, as well as fellow board members and or some that might be have experience in this area, because a lot of times board members bring so many different experiences to the table in their career. But it's leveraging all of this and really following its attention to detail. You know, the devil's in the detail comment is so real, right? This is where it can come back and bite you down the road. So the importance of following a protocol and following steps and really pressure testing this with the professionals you surround yourself with is important. And it's to be educated in it. You know, you're not the experts. You're a board member supervising, overseeing, managing the experts, but you should have some background and knowledge of that. So a big thank you to the team. I'm going to pass it over to Eileen, who's going to facilitate the questions. So please feel free to email us your questions. I'm happy to answer those with this panel. So Eileen.
Thank you, Michael. We've got a lot of great questions this morning. The first one goes to Tim. Is the estimated dollar value to be funded for an item 100% of cost or perhaps less, for example, 85% of the replacement cost?
That is a very advanced mathematical question. But so we talked about full funding versus versus threshold funding. So in full funding, we are making sure that every year we're putting, if it's a 10-year replacement, we're putting 1/10 away every month, right? Every year. So that's full funding, right? We are putting all that money in. Now, when we pick a threshold, we still want to have 100% of the replacement cost in there. But what happens is when you use full funding, you end up with a lot more money than you need at any given time. There's a lot more cash in the bank than you really need. So we pick a threshold where we know we can fund 100% of our replacements each year. But it might not be fully funded, but we always have enough cash to pay 100%. So I hope that answers your question. So yes, we're always putting 100% in. It's just kind of how we disperse it along the curve over the years.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Stacy, the next question goes to you. In states that do not have an asset study requirement, is it ever advantageous for an HOA to perform the study versus hiring an outside professional? And what are the pros and cons of doing this in-house?
Great question. I always recommend that you have a professional at least come out the first time. And if there's someone on the board who's able to help update that, the pros of using a professional is that they're able to come out, take a look at your assets that you have to maintain. And with that useful life process, they also let you know if there's any repairs that might need to be done on an operational basis for those components. So unless you have somebody on the board who is an engineer or has that type of background, it's more than just getting some numbers. It's more than just kind of Googling the information and saying, hey, how much is asphalt these days? So we always recommend that you use a professional for that. In today's world, what I have seen is that the studies are really coming down as far as pricing, and so it should be something that the association can afford. And in most states, they allow you to pay for the cost of that study out of the reserve funds itself. So I hope that fully answers the question.
Great advice. Next question is to Tori. Other than transparency with the members of the HOA, are there best practices with communicating and implementing the reserve study and the resulting HOA increases with a property that is underfunded?
Yeah, awesome question. So when you're presenting a reserve study and you first get your reserve study as the board of directors and you see, oh goodness, they're recommending items that we do not have money for, but we do need to be transparent with the association. This is where it's great to utilize presenting the reserve study in such a way, almost in a PowerPoint presentation to the community, to let them know that this is what the board is going to be tasked with moving forward with budgeting and forecasting. So they're aware ahead of time that the board did do their due diligence to the community to get this professional knowledge for the association, so you guys can start planning now. Now, there are options that if you're severely underfunded, but you do have priority projects that need to get done, lenders, in fact, will be more happy to lend to associations when they see that it comes from a professional reserve study specialist, instead of just having a homeowner go out to feel like they're looking at this because they are Googling options, just like Stacy was just talking about. So it is that good transparency piece to present that ahead of time, usually before your budgeting season starts, and to let them know, hey guys, this is what we're working on. We are keeping the best interest of the community in mind when we're looking at options. And before you guys make that official decision, I think as much meetings as you can have, even during COVID, making use of your conference calls, teleconference calls. Obviously, if you don't have a meeting space that you can social distance enough, but keeping them in the loop as much as possible with your next step moving forward.
Thank you, Tori. Tim, the next question goes to you, and we have several questions around this. What's a reasonable range of fees for a reserve study?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and that's going to really depend on, you know, where you are, right? The market you're in is going to drive a lot of these costs, but generally, depending on where you go, a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, you can expect to see a fully comprehensive reserve study run anywhere from about $17,000 to about, I would say, $30,000 for a really good level 1 reserve study. Not to say that that's necessary for all communities, though. Remember, one size, you know, does not fit all. Depending on the community, depending on how many components you're looking at replacing, you know, depending on the size, the square footage, the mechanicals, or other, you know, more complex items. But, you know, it is an investment that you have to really think about. It's an investment in the future financial health of the community. So it's a difficult question to answer because it is going to really depend on what your market is and, you know, where, in what type of community you are. For, you know, smaller communities, I see them as low as, you know, $7,000, $10,000. But we get into larger communities, the cost is going to go up. So it's really, you need to go out there, do your homework, and look for the best price that you can find with the services that you desire.
Thank you, Tim. Our next question is going to actually go out to Alan Trachtenberg, our in-house counsel. What is the threshold for an owner bringing a lawsuit against the association if they have a feeling about fiduciary responsibility of the board to complete repairs?
Good morning. What is the threshold? I mean, if a unit owner, still unit owners can certainly, you know, file lawsuits against the board if they feel, you know, the board is breaching its fiduciary duty. I mean, unit owners should understand when they're suing an association, they're suing themselves too, because the claim's going to be picked up by the association's directors and officers coverage, so long as they did act reasonably and within their fiduciary duties. reached out to, professional engineers and assisted with the preparation of the reserve study. Not exactly sure where the question's going, Eileen.
Perhaps we can get a follow-up to that question before the end of the call, but appreciate the input, Ellen. Our next question is going to go out to Stacy. We have been advised to not dip below a certain dollar amount. We don't know who advised the number, so we're unable to ask questions on how that number was determined. It was not the firm that conducted the study. Are you aware of how a suggested level of funds not to dip below is determined?
Great question. So at the end of the day, it's the board of directors who makes all the decisions and decides on that threshold. They definitely should, in making that decision, consult with their professional management professionals as well as their auditors, and if they need to, also bring in their attorneys. But it is the board that sets that threshold level if there aren't any state or jurisdiction guidelines on that.
Excellent, thank you. Tori, the next question goes to you. What is the typical or standard percentage of income or benchmark that a board can follow when determining what percentage of income should be allocated to support the funding of reserves?
Yeah, great question. So for that, it's really going to depend on what your percentage is already allocated for your individual community, depending on what type of community you have. If it's a master, do you have sub-communities underneath you? It really depends on how much income you have coming in to know what you're going to put forth to your reserve study and how many common property areas that you have that you need to maintain and probably reserve for. You may not have as much as one community, so that percentage is going to vary. So if you had an extensive list, then that reserve fund is going to be much higher percentage, probably in the 40 to 50 range. It just truly depends on what your community is looking at. And that reserve study specialist, with making sure that you guys ask for the financial analysis of that, because as Tim touched on, there are two different components with that as well. So making sure that you have that so they can be able to tell you by looking at your individual community's financial health and your financials itself, so they can tell you this is exactly what you should be looking at so you guys don't get in a negative or deficient with your reserve funds itself. It just truly depends individually on what type of community you live in.
Thank you, Tori. Tim, next one is for you. How long does it take for a reserve study to be completed if you're looking for the most detailed review?
Oh, terrific question. You a lot of times when you write your RFP, you might want to put a timeline in. But, for the most comprehensive review, you're probably looking at 90 days from the first draft, making sure that when the start date is, because depending on who you hire, they might not be able to start right away. They might take them 30 days on your list. But generally, you should expect from the day they start you get the first draft to about 90 days. Now, the final draft may take a little longer because, as we talked about, going in iterations of meeting with the board and working through those things, bringing in management, questioning management on issues, and kind of putting all the financials together. But the initial draft, a lot of that work is done really between the reserve provider and the manager and the management company. So you should expect about a 90-day turnover in most cases.
Thank you, Tim. Stacy, how does the board select someone to estimate the lifespan of items we wish to include in the reserve study?
I believe the question is about selecting a company to do the reserve study, and that you're usually contacting your manager or your management company, or CAI, which is the Community Associations Institute. There's a national organization for board members, homeowners, managers, professionals, and they will also have a directory of licensed reserve specialists.
Super. Tori, we have a couple of questions around inflation. Our reserve provides replacement costs in 2019 dollars. What inflation rate would you recommend for estimating future year costs?
Great question. So usually the standard is at least 2 to 3%, and it depends on which area you live in the United States, and to know what your state's cost, looking at consumer reports to know what is increasing around you. And that reserve specialist study as well can help assist with that and to giving that information, but it's going to vary around the economy that you live in, because each place will be different in regards to building materials, time and labor, et cetera. And you want to make sure that you are keeping up with the economy shift, especially what's going on with COVID-19 that has adjusted building materials itself as well. So you want to know how warehouses are working, and it's truly going to be based off helping with the consumer reports. Your reserve specialist will always be able to answer questions depending on what type of reserve study that you contract them out with, to know what available times and meetings. And it depends on which company you go with as well, because they're usually always helpful if you have a quick question, maybe 6 months down the road with something like that. And they can always direct you as well to good local consumer reports that you can look at. But definitely keeping up with the economy shift is key here, because if you get a reserve study 3 years ago and you're wanting to make sure that those prices are not extremely high or maybe even lower in some cases, that is what you want to make sure you're doing, is keeping up that economy shift.
Great, thank you. We're going to pass the last question over to Tim. What happens if you're constantly over budget on projects because the reserve study has been incorrect for the previous year?
Wow, that's a great question. So if you're always over budget, then you're probably looking at doing a new reserve study. If you're not getting good data from your reserve study, and you might be looking at going back and doing a complete level one, because we talked about the level one. And when do you need a level one? Generally, you need a level one if you've never had a reserve study before. If it's been a long time since you had your last reserve study, well beyond the 5-year threshold. Or if you just feel like the reserve study you had before wasn't very good. So if you're constantly going over budget on reserve items, it's really important to have that good level one, to go through that process with your reserve provider that we spoke about, to make sure that, we're getting some real numbers and they really understand, what the financial needs of the association are. So that's about the best advice I can give you as far as reserve studies go. Now, you're going to have to find alternative ways of funding to make up that difference if your reserves are where they should be. And so that's another item you need to look at, but that's kind of getting beyond the scope of reserve studies.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to pass it back over to Michael.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim and Tori, as well as Stacy. Great topics, fantastic questions. We had a lot of questions that came in today, so super engagement by all of our listeners, and we so appreciate our boards and the boards out there for all the hard work and the support over a very, very difficult time this past year, as well as it will unfortunately bleed into this year. For a good portion of it, we're probably going to see similar challenges through the majority of this year. But it is important, as we stated, that the day-to-day continues to function as well as in the community. So tremendous job. We appreciate all of our listeners. We look forward to, in the next, I think 2 weeks, we'll have another webinar, and we'll keep you posted on everything. But until then, have a terrific day, a terrific weekend, and we will see you soon. Thank you very much, everybody.